The hardest truth about love is that your heart often makes its choice long before your mind is willing to understand it. Lucas Bennett had always believed his life made perfect sense. At 27, he had a steady career as a marketing consultant in Chicago, a close circle of friends, weekend basketball games, and enough confidence to assume he already knew exactly who he was. If anyone had asked him about his future, he would have answered without hesitation. Work hard, eventually meet the right woman, get married someday, and build the kind of ordinary life he had always imagined. There was nothing unusual about that plan, and for years he never questioned it. There was, however, one constant that quietly existed in every version of his future without him ever noticing. Adrian Cole. At 29, Adrian had been Lucas's closest friend since their freshman year of college. They met during orientation after getting hopelessly lost trying to find the same lecture hall, laughed at their terrible sense of direction, and somehow never stopped talking after that day. Over the years, they celebrated promotions together, helped each other move apartments, survived broken-down cars on road trips, watched countless baseball games from the cheapest seats they could find, and developed the comfortable habit of calling each other before anyone else whenever something important happened. Lucas never considered that unusual. As far as he was concerned, that was simply what best friends did. One Saturday afternoon, an invitation arrived for the wedding of one of their college roommates. The ceremony would take place in early autumn at a lakeside venue outside Milwaukee, and every guest was encouraged to bring someone. Lucas smiled while reading the invitation before immediately reaching for his phone. He did not stop to think. He did not compare options. His thumb instinctively found Adrian's name before anyone else's. Adrian answered after only 2 rings. "You called before I could even text you," he joked. Lucas laughed. "Wedding invitation. You are coming with me." Adrian chuckled softly. "I figured you would ask." "Good," Lucas replied. "Then you cannot say no." "I was not planning to." The conversation drifted naturally toward travel plans, hotel reservations, and whether they should leave Friday night or early Saturday morning. It felt like every other conversation they had shared over the past 8 years. Easy, familiar, effortless. Lucas never questioned why inviting Adrian had been his first instinct. At work the following Monday, one of his coworkers noticed the invitation resting beside his laptop. "So," she asked with a playful smile, "who is your date?" Lucas answered without looking up from his screen. "Adrian." She raised an eyebrow. "Your friend Adrian?" "Yeah." "Interesting." Lucas finally looked at her. "What is interesting about that?" She laughed lightly. "Nothing. It is just funny that whenever there is a wedding, party, concert, baseball game, or vacation, you always bring him before anyone else." Lucas shrugged. "He is my best friend." Another coworker overheard the conversation and smiled. "Honestly, you two already act like an old married couple." Everyone laughed, including Lucas, who dismissed the joke without another thought. Yet for reasons he could not explain, those words stayed with him much longer than they should have. That evening he met Adrian at their favorite neighborhood coffee shop, where the barista already knew both their orders by heart. They settled into the same corner table they had occupied dozens of times before, talking about work deadlines, a new baseball season, and the upcoming wedding. Nothing about the evening felt different. Yet Lucas caught himself watching Adrian laugh beneath the warm cafe lights and experienced the smallest, strangest feeling that something inside his ordinary life had quietly begun to shift, even though he could not yet give it a name. The days leading up to the wedding passed with the familiar rhythm Lucas and Adrian had built over nearly a decade without ever thinking about it. Every Wednesday, they met at the same neighborhood coffee shop after work. Every Friday, they ordered takeout from the small Italian restaurant that always included extra breadsticks because the owner recognized them. Sunday afternoons usually ended with a baseball game on television, unfinished conversations stretching from one inning to the next while Adrian quietly criticized the manager's decisions and Lucas insisted he could have coached the team better himself. None of those traditions felt remarkable. They simply felt permanent. One evening, only a week before the wedding, Lucas stayed late at the office preparing a presentation for an important client. By the time he finished, the downtown streets were nearly empty. Without thinking, he reached for his phone and called Adrian while walking toward the parking garage. Adrian answered almost immediately. "Long day?" he asked. Lucas smiled despite his exhaustion. "How did you know?" Adrian laughed softly. You only call this late when work has been exhausting or when you want to complain about traffic. Lucas looked around at the quiet city lights reflecting across nearby buildings. Both. Adrian listened patiently while Lucas described a difficult meeting, an impossible deadline, and a client who could not decide what they wanted. He never interrupted. He simply asked thoughtful questions until Lucas found himself laughing instead of complaining. By the time he reached his car, the stress that had weighed on him all afternoon seemed much lighter. "Thanks," Lucas said before ending the call. "For what?" Adrian asked. Lucas hesitated. "I do not know." "For always answering." Adrian's voice remained as calm as ever. "You have always done the same for me." After hanging up, Lucas sat quietly behind the steering wheel for several seconds before starting the engine. He realized something unusual. Whenever something good happened, Adrian was the first person he wanted to tell. Whenever something difficult happened, Adrian was still the first person he called. The thought crossed his mind only briefly before he dismissed it as another sign of a strong friendship. The following Saturday, they drove to Milwaukee together for the wedding weekend. The highway stretched ahead beneath clear blue skies, while classic rock played softly through the speakers. Adrian insisted on bringing homemade sandwiches instead of stopping for fast food, claiming the drive would be more enjoyable that way. Lucas teased him for planning every road trip with military precision, yet happily accepted one of the sandwiches anyway. Several hours later, they arrived at the lakeside resort where friends from college were already gathering. Laughter filled the lobby as everyone greeted one another after years apart. During the welcome dinner, Lucas wandered toward the outdoor patio overlooking the water. Adrian followed a few minutes later, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea without needing to ask which drink Lucas preferred. They stood together watching the sunset paint the lake with shades of orange and gold. One of their old college friends walked past, smiled knowingly, and joked, "You two still cannot spend more than 5 minutes apart." Lucas laughed automatically. "Someone has to keep him out of trouble." Adrian grinned. "Pretty sure that has always been your job." Their friend shook his head with amused disbelief before walking away. "Seriously," he called over his shoulder. "One day one of you is going to realize what everyone else already sees." Lucas frowned slightly as the words lingered in the evening air. What was that supposed to mean? Adrian simply shrugged, taking another sip of iced tea while watching the lake. "Probably nothing." Lucas nodded, yet for reasons he could not explain, the comment refused to leave his thoughts. As music drifted across the quiet water and guests continued laughing nearby, he looked toward Adrian once more and wondered why everyone else seemed convinced they noticed something he still could not see. The wedding day arrived beneath a bright September sky, with gentle sunlight shimmering across the quiet lake, while white flowers lined the wooden aisle leading toward the ceremony. Guests gathered in small groups, laughing as photographers captured familiar faces reunited after years apart. Lucas adjusted the collar of his navy suit while standing in front of the mirror inside the lodge, trying to straighten a tie that never seemed to cooperate. A quiet knock sounded on the door before Adrian stepped inside, already dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly. Without saying a word, Adrian walked over, loosened the tie, and retied it with practiced hands. "You still cannot do this properly," he teased. Lucas laughed. "That is why I keep you around." Adrian smiled warmly. "I had a feeling you would say that." The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt strangely comfortable, like countless mornings and evenings they had already shared over the years. They walked together toward the ceremony, greeting old classmates along the way. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to see them, and more than one friend jokingly asked whether they had driven together again. Lucas answered yes each time without thinking anything of it. During the ceremony, he watched the bride and groom exchange heartfelt vows about choosing each other every single day, not because life would always be easy, but because they wanted to face every ordinary and extraordinary moment together. Lucas smiled as the guests applauded, yet those words echoed quietly inside his thoughts long after everyone moved toward the reception hall. Throughout dinner, Adrian naturally reached across the table whenever Lucas forgot the breadbasket, refilled his glass before he noticed it was empty, and quietly remembered that Lucas disliked mushrooms when selecting dishes from the buffet. None of those gestures felt unusual. They had always taken care of each other that way. Even so, Lucas suddenly became aware that he could not remember the last meaningful memory in his adult life that did not include Adrian somewhere nearby. After dinner, the music began, and guests slowly filled the dance floor. Lucas stood near the edge of the room talking with a few college friends when one of the bridesmaids approached carrying 2 slices of wedding cake. She handed one to Lucas before asking with a cheerful smile, "So where is your boyfriend?" Lucas nearly laughed hard enough to drop the plate. "He is not my boyfriend," he answered quickly. She looked genuinely surprised. "Really? I just assumed." Lucas pointed across the room where Adrian was helping one of the older guests carry several gift boxes toward a storage table. "That is Adrian. He is my best friend." She smiled kindly. "Well, whoever he is, I have never seen someone watch another person the way he watches you." Lucas instinctively turned toward Adrian again. At that exact moment, Adrian looked back, noticed Lucas searching the crowded room, and smiled with the quiet familiarity that had always made every unfamiliar place feel comfortable. Lucas smiled back automatically before realizing what had just happened. Out of hundreds of people filling the reception hall, they had somehow found each other without trying. Later that evening, while guests gathered outside to watch lanterns drift across the lake, Lucas stood beside Adrian beneath the cool autumn sky. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They simply watched the reflections ripple across the water until Adrian quietly asked, "You seem distracted today. Everything all right?" Lucas nodded almost immediately. "Yeah, I'm just thinking." Adrian waited patiently before smiling. "About what?" Lucas looked toward the floating lights before answering honestly. "I do not know yet. I just feel like everyone keeps noticing something about us that I have somehow spent years missing." Adrian remained silent, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, while the lanterns continued drifting farther across the dark water, carrying with them questions Lucas could no longer dismiss as easily as before. When the wedding weekend ended, life in Chicago quietly returned to normal, at least on the surface. Lucas unpacked his suitcase, answered overdue emails, and slipped back into the familiar rhythm of client meetings and marketing campaigns. Yet something inside him refused to settle as easily as everything else. Small moments from the wedding kept replaying without invitation. Adrian straightening his tie before the ceremony. Friends casually assuming they were more than best friends. The bridesmaid asking where his boyfriend was. Those memories did not embarrass Lucas nearly as much as the strange feeling they left behind. He found himself wondering why none of those comments had truly upset him. They had simply made him think. A few weeks later, one of Lucas's co-workers introduced him to Emily, a kind elementary school teacher who immediately shared his love of baseball, bookstores, and weekend road trips. Their first dinner was pleasant. Conversation flowed naturally, and Emily laughed at all the right moments. By every reasonable standard, the evening was successful. When Lucas returned to his apartment afterward, he reached for his phone without thinking and called Adrian before he even took off his jacket. Adrian answered with his usual cheerful voice. "How did the date go?" Lucas smiled while loosening his tie. "It was nice." Adrian laughed softly. "Only nice." Lucas walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator even though he was not hungry. "She is funny, smart, easy to talk to." "That sounds promising," Adrian replied. Lucas nodded even though Adrian could not see him. "Yeah, it does." They continued talking for nearly 40 minutes about everything except the date itself. They discussed a new sports podcast, an upcoming baseball game, and whether they should finally replace the aging coffee maker Adrian had been complaining about for months. After hanging up, Lucas stood quietly in his kitchen with his phone still in his hand. An uncomfortable realization settled over him. He had spent less than 5 minutes thinking about Emily and nearly an hour talking to Adrian. He tried to ignore that thought, convincing himself it was only because Adrian already knew him better than anyone else. Over the next several weeks, Lucas and Emily continued seeing each other. She was thoughtful, patient, and genuinely enjoyable to spend time with. Yet every meaningful experience somehow reminded him of Adrian. A new cafe made him wonder whether Adrian would like the coffee. A baseball game felt incomplete because the empty seat beside him belonged in his mind to someone else. Even when Emily recommended a movie, Lucas caught himself thinking he should tell Adrian about it afterward. None of those thoughts made sense, and Lucas became increasingly frustrated with himself. One evening, Emily smiled warmly across the dinner table and asked, "Who is the first person you usually call when something exciting happens?" Lucas answered before he even realized he was speaking. "Adrian." Emily nodded politely. And when you have a terrible day? Lucas looked down at his coffee. Adrian. She remained kind, but her gentle smile carried quiet understanding. I hope you do not mind me saying this, she said carefully. But every story you tell somehow finds its way back to him. Lucas blinked in surprise. Emily continued softly. I do not think you are trying to compare us. I just think he is the center of more of your life than you have realized. They ended the evening with mutual respect, agreeing that forcing a relationship that never felt completely present would be unfair to both of them. As Lucas drove home beneath the glow of Chicago streetlights, he realized he did not feel heartbreak over the relationship ending. Instead, he felt confused by the question Emily had quietly left behind. If Adrian had become the person he measured every meaningful moment against, what did that truly say about the feelings he had spent years calling nothing more than friendship? Autumn slowly settled over Chicago, painting neighborhood parks with shades of gold and crimson, while cooler air drifted through the city each morning. Lucas tried convincing himself that ending things with Emily had simply confirmed they were not the right match, yet the quiet question she had left behind refused to disappear. Every ordinary moment seemed to lead back to Adrian in ways Lucas could no longer ignore. One Saturday morning, he walked into his favorite coffee shop intending to spend a few peaceful hours catching up on work. As he reached the counter, the barista smiled and asked, "Just one coffee today? Your friend is not with you." Lucas hesitated before answering. He had to work this morning. The barista nodded with an understanding smile. "Well, tell him we miss seeing you both together." Lucas carried his coffee to the corner table they always shared, only to realize he had unconsciously chosen the same seats they had occupied for years. He looked at the empty chair across from him and quietly laughed at himself. Even when Adrian was not there, Lucas still organized his world as if he would arrive any minute. Later that afternoon, Adrian finally joined him after finishing work. The conversation flowed as naturally as always. They discussed a documentary they both wanted to watch, debated which baseball team had the better off-season strategy, and laughed about an embarrassing memory from college involving a camping trip and an inflatable mattress that refused to stay inflated. Hours passed without either of them noticing. As evening approached, Adrian glanced at his watch. "I should probably head home. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Lucas nodded, but an unexpected disappointment settled inside him the moment Adrian stood to leave. It was not dramatic or overwhelming. It simply felt as though the day was ending sooner than he wanted it to. Driving home alone, Lucas caught himself smiling at something Adrian had said earlier before the smile slowly faded into thoughtful silence. He finally admitted something to himself that he had been avoiding for weeks. Every place he loved somehow felt more complete when Adrian was there. The realization frightened him because he still did not know what it meant. A few days later, Adrian called with unexpected news. "My company offered me a temporary leadership position in Boston," he explained. "It would last about 6 months. Lucas froze for a brief moment before forcing himself to sound supportive. "That is amazing. Congratulations." Adrian smiled through the phone. "I have not accepted yet. I wanted to think about it first." Lucas congratulated him again, and they ended the conversation after discussing practical details, but the apartment suddenly felt unusually quiet once the call ended. For the first time since they met nearly 9 years earlier, Lucas imagined an ordinary week without spontaneous dinners, weekend baseball games, random coffee runs, or late-night phone calls answered within 2 rings. The image left an emptiness he had never experienced before. Over the following days, he tried distracting himself with work, the gym, and dinners with coworkers, yet every routine seemed strangely incomplete. One evening, he opened his refrigerator and laughed softly after noticing the extra container of Adrian's favorite pasta sauce he had absent-mindedly purchased during grocery shopping. Another morning, he instinctively reached for his phone to send Adrian a funny article. Before remembering, he had already shared 3 different stories with him the night before. Lucas slowly understood that this was not simply missing a best friend. This was missing the person who had quietly become the center of every ordinary day without ever asking for that place. Standing alone by his apartment window as the city lights flickered below, Lucas whispered words he had never imagined saying aloud. "What if everyone else saw the truth long before I did?" The following weekend arrived far sooner than Lucas expected. Bright autumn sunlight filled the streets of Chicago, But the warmth did little to quiet the questions that had occupied his thoughts ever since Adrian mentioned Boston. They met for breakfast at the small diner they had visited almost every Saturday for years. The waitress greeted them by name before placing 2 mugs of coffee on the table without asking for their order. "The usual?" she asked with a smile. They both nodded at the same time, laughed, and exchanged the familiar look that came from years of shared routines. For the first time, Lucas wondered how many of those ordinary moments he had mistaken for simple habit when they had actually become the foundation of his happiest memories. As breakfast continued, Adrian casually mentioned another meeting with his company's leadership team the following week. "They want my final answer soon," he said while stirring cream into his coffee. Lucas forced a smile. "You would be great there." Adrian looked at him carefully. "You really think so?" Lucas nodded, even though something inside him wished those words were not true. "You have worked hard for this opportunity." Adrian thanked him quietly before changing the subject to an upcoming baseball game. But Lucas found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything else. Every sentence seemed to carry the possibility that their ordinary weekends might soon become phone calls across different cities. Later that afternoon, they walked through Lincoln Park beneath trees glowing with shades of orange and red. Families pushed strollers along winding paths, while children laughed near the pond. It was one of those peaceful afternoons Lucas normally loved, yet every familiar place suddenly felt fragile because he imagined experiencing it without Adrian beside him. They stopped at a quiet bench overlooking the water. Adrian leaned back comfortably and smiled. "We have probably sat here 20 times over the years." Lucas looked across the pond before answering softly. "Probably more." Silence settled between them, comfortable as always, but Lucas noticed how differently he experienced it now. It was no longer simply the quiet shared by best friends. It was the silence of someone realizing that another person had become essential to the shape of everyday life. After a while, Adrian glanced toward him. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas nodded. "Of course." Adrian hesitated briefly. "If I accept Boston, do you think things between us would stay the same?" Lucas felt his heart tighten. He wanted to answer yes, because that seemed like the reasonable response. Instead, honesty arrived before caution. "I do not know." Adrian looked surprised, but remained quiet. Lucas continued carefully. "We would still talk. We would still visit. But it would not be the same." Adrian slowly nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I was thinking the same thing." Those simple words echoed through Lucas long after they left the park. That evening he returned to his apartment and absent-mindedly opened an old storage box while searching for a phone charger. Inside were photographs from college, ticket stubs from baseball games, receipts from road trips, and handwritten birthday cards. Almost every memory included Adrian. There they were standing beside the Grand Canyon after driving across 3 states together. There they were wearing matching team jerseys at their first Major League Baseball game. There they were celebrating Lucas's promotion with cheap pizza, because neither of them cared where they ate as long as they were together. Lucas sat on the living room floor surrounded by years of ordinary moments that suddenly formed one unmistakable picture. He had never been choosing a destination, an event, or an activity. Every single time life offered him a choice, he had chosen Adrian first. The realization no longer frightened him. Instead, it brought an unexpected sense of peace, because for the first time he stopped asking himself who he was supposed to love and finally began asking the only question that mattered. If the person he wanted beside him in every chapter of his life was Adrian, then perhaps his heart had already known the answer for years before his mind was ready to understand it. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air, yet Lucas carried an unfamiliar calm instead of the confusion that had followed him for weeks. For the first time, he was no longer trying to convince himself that his feelings were something else. He had stopped searching for explanations and quietly accepted a simple truth. Every important decision in his adult life somehow began with Adrian. Every celebration felt incomplete until Adrian arrived. Every disappointment became easier after hearing Adrian's voice. The realization did not make Lucas feel frightened anymore. Instead, it made years of ordinary memories suddenly make perfect sense. That afternoon Adrian called during his lunch break. "The meeting is tomorrow," he said. "They will probably expect my answer about Boston before the week ends." Lucas looked out the office window toward the busy Chicago streets below. "Can we meet tonight?" he asked. Adrian smiled through the phone. Of course. Same place. Lucas nodded, even though Adrian could not see him. Same place. That evening they met at the quiet rooftop terrace above the bookstore cafe, where they often escaped the noise of downtown. The city lights slowly appeared as the sun disappeared behind the skyline, and a cool breeze carried the scent of approaching fall. They sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee resting untouched between them. Adrian immediately noticed something different. "You have been unusually quiet lately," he said gently. Lucas smiled faintly. "I know." Adrian waited with the same patience that had always made difficult conversations feel safe. After several moments, Lucas finally spoke. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Adrian nodded. "Always." Lucas took a slow breath. "If you accept Boston, are you hoping I will tell you to stay?" Adrian looked down at his coffee before answering. "I told myself I should not hope for that." Lucas frowned slightly. "Why?" Adrian looked back at him with calm sincerity. "Because I never wanted you to feel responsible for my choices." Silence settled between them. It was not uncomfortable. It simply carried the weight of years neither of them had fully understood. Lucas looked across the familiar table and realized he had spent nearly a decade believing the strongest relationships always arrived with certainty from the beginning. Instead, the greatest relationship in his life had quietly grown beside him until one ordinary day he finally recognized it. "There is something I need to tell you," Lucas said softly. Adrian remained completely still. Lucas continued before fear could interrupt him. "When everyone kept asking why I always chose you first, I laughed because I thought the answer was obvious. You were my best friend." He smiled gently. "Then people kept saying things that stayed in my head longer than they should have. The wedding, Emily, even strangers at the coffee shop." Adrian listened without saying a word. Lucas looked toward the city lights before returning his eyes to Adrian. "I spent weeks trying to figure out whether something about me had suddenly changed." He shook his head with a quiet laugh. "Nothing changed." Adrian's expression softened. Lucas smiled with peaceful certainty. "I simply realized that every important choice I have ever made already included you. I called you before everyone else. I looked for you in every crowded room. I imagined every future with you standing somewhere beside me. I thought that was ordinary because it had always been true." His voice became steadier with every sentence. "I kept believing I was choosing a friend. The truth is, I was choosing the person who mattered most long before I understood why." Adrian's eyes filled with quiet emotion, yet he still allowed Lucas the space to finish. Lucas reached across the table and gently rested his hand beside Adrian's. "I do not know exactly when friendship became something deeper. I only know that if you leave for Boston without hearing this, I will regret my silence. For the rest of my life. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that if life asks me to choose one person before everyone else, my answer has already been you for years." For several long seconds Adrian said nothing. The city lights shimmered beyond the rooftop, and the quiet between them carried years of shared memories instead of uncertainty. Lucas wondered if he had said too much or waited far too long. Then Adrian smiled, not with surprise, but with the kind of gentle relief that only appeared after carrying a burden for a very long time. He looked down briefly before meeting Lucas's eyes again. "Do you know what the hardest part has been?" he asked softly. Lucas slowly shook his head. Adrian let out a quiet breath. "Pretending that being your best friend was enough, because I never wanted to lose even that." Lucas remained perfectly still, allowing Adrian to continue. "I realized my feelings years ago," Adrian admitted. "Probably sometime after our 3rd road trip together. I kept noticing that every place felt better because you were there. Every success meant more if you were the first person I could tell. But I also knew how you talked about your future back then. You were certain you understood yourself, and I respected that." Lucas listened with growing emotion as Adrian smiled gently. "I promised myself that I would never ask you to question who you were. If one day your feelings changed naturally, I wanted that choice to belong entirely to you. If they never changed, I would still have been grateful for every year we shared as friends." Lucas felt his throat tighten. "You carried all of that by yourself?" Adrian laughed quietly. "It became easier than you think. You gave me so many reasons to stay happy. Watching baseball together, late-night coffee, random phone calls, helping each other move apartments. Those moments were real. I never wanted to lose them by asking for something you were not ready to give." Lucas looked down at the untouched coffee between them before smiling through the emotion filling his chest. All this time I thought I was protecting our friendship. Adrian nodded. We were both protecting it. They laughed softly together, realizing how many years had passed because two people cared too much to risk hurting one another. A cool breeze drifted across the rooftop as the lights of Chicago stretched endlessly beyond them. Lucas finally asked the question that mattered most. So what happens now? Adrian looked at him with the same calm warmth Lucas had trusted for nearly a decade. Now nothing has to be rushed. You spent years discovering something important about yourself. I do not want you to feel pressured to move faster than your heart is comfortable with. Lucas smiled gratefully. That is exactly why I love being with you. He paused for a moment before correcting himself with a small laugh. Actually, I think that is exactly why I fell in love with you without realizing it. Adrian's eyes softened as he reached across the table and gently held Lucas's hand for the first time. The gesture felt surprisingly natural, as though years of friendship had quietly prepared them for this single moment. There was no dramatic music, no grand audience, and no perfect movie scene. There were only 2 cups of cooling coffee, a peaceful rooftop above a familiar bookstore, and 2 people who had finally stopped hiding from a truth that had patiently waited for them. The next morning, Adrian attended his leadership meeting in Boston by video conference. When the discussion turned to the 6-month transfer, he thanked the executives sincerely before explaining that he had decided to remain in Chicago. They accepted his decision with understanding, promising future opportunities would still be available. That evening, Adrian met Lucas outside the coffee shop where countless ordinary conversations had shaped their lives. Lucas smiled as soon as he saw him walking toward the entrance. So, Lucas asked with quiet hope, what did you choose? Adrian smiled back with complete certainty. The same person I have been choosing for years. Lucas laughed warmly, realizing that for the first time neither of them needed to wonder whether they were walking toward the same future, because they had finally chosen it together. 1 year passed with remarkable quietness, and Lucas often found himself wondering why he had once believed happiness needed to arrive through dramatic moments. The greatest change in his life had not come from one confession on a rooftop or one important decision about Boston. It had come from hundreds of ordinary mornings that followed. Coffee brewed while Adrian prepared breakfast. Weekend walks along the Chicago River. Grocery shopping that somehow turned into an hour of laughing over recipes neither of them planned to cook. Baseball games where they still argued about every questionable coaching decision exactly as they always had. The routines themselves had barely changed. The only difference was that neither of them had to pretend anymore. One Saturday afternoon, they returned to the same lakeside resort outside Milwaukee where their friend's wedding had taken place the year before. The newly married couple had organized a casual anniversary picnic and invited everyone back for the weekend. As Lucas stepped onto the familiar wooden walkway overlooking the lake, memories rushed back almost immediately. This was where friends had joked about him always choosing Adrian first. This was where strangers had mistaken them for a couple before either of them understood why. Standing beside the water now, Lucas smiled because every confusing moment from that weekend finally made perfect sense. During the picnic, several old college friends gathered around a large wooden table, sharing stories from work and family life. One of them laughed while looking at Lucas and Adrian. You know, he said, I have to admit something. We all spent years wondering how long it would take. Lucas raised an amused eyebrow. How long what would take? Another friend smiled warmly. For both of you to notice what everyone else noticed almost immediately. Lucas looked toward Adrian before laughing at himself. Apparently, I was the last person to figure it out. Adrian gently nudged his shoulder. You got there eventually. Everyone laughed together, not because the story was surprising anymore, but because it felt so perfectly natural. Later that evening, the guests gathered near the lake as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Lucas and Adrian wandered away from the crowd, following the same quiet shoreline where they had stood together 1 year earlier after the wedding reception. The water reflected soft shades of orange and purple, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh grass. Lucas stopped walking and looked across the peaceful lake. Do you remember what I told you after the ceremony last year? Adrian nodded thoughtfully. You said everyone seemed to notice something you could not see. Lucas smiled. I finally understand why. He turned toward Adrian with calm confidence. I spent so many years asking myself whether I was changing into someone different. The truth is, I was never becoming someone new. Adrian listened quietly. Lucas continued with a peaceful smile. I was simply discovering that love is not about fitting into the picture you imagined when you were younger. It is about recognizing the person who has quietly become your safest place without you realizing it. Adrian reached for Lucas's hand naturally, and together they watched the final sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. Lucas realized that his heart had never been confused. It had been patient. Long before he understood himself, it had already known exactly where home was. Looking back on every road trip, every late-night phone call, every baseball game, every cup of coffee, and every ordinary decision that had always led him toward Adrian, Lucas finally understood the simplest truth of all. Life had given him countless choices over the years, yet without ever realizing it, he had already chosen the same person every single time. And in the quiet certainty of that realization, he discovered that the greatest love stories are not about changing who you are. They are about finally understanding who your heart has been choosing all along. As another winter settled over Chicago, Lucas realized that the greatest gift he and Adrian had given each other was not a dramatic confession or a perfect ending. It was the freedom to remain exactly who they had always been, while finally understanding why their lives had naturally fit together for so many years. Snow covered the sidewalks outside their apartment building, and every Saturday, morning still began with the same familiar routine. Adrian brewed fresh coffee while Lucas prepared breakfast, insisting his pancakes had improved even though Adrian continued teasing him about burning the first one nearly every weekend. They laughed the same way they had laughed years earlier as best friends. Only now, every ordinary moment carried the quiet confidence that neither of them needed to hide what those moments truly meant. One afternoon, Lucas received an invitation to speak at a marketing conference in Denver. The event included a formal dinner where attendees were encouraged to bring a guest. Looking at the invitation, Lucas smiled before instinctively reaching for his phone. Halfway through dialing, he stopped and laughed to himself. Adrian looked up from the living room sofa where he had been reading a novel. "What is so funny?" Lucas walked over and handed him the invitation. "I almost forgot that I do not have to wonder who I am bringing anymore." Adrian smiled warmly. "I never minded being your automatic choice." Lucas sat beside him with an amused shake of his head. "That is the thing. You were always my automatic choice. I just spent years pretending there had to be another explanation." Adrian closed his book and looked at Lucas with quiet affection. Sometimes life teaches us important things very slowly because we need time to recognize them. A few weeks later, they arrived at the conference together. During the evening reception, Lucas introduced Adrian to several colleagues, many of whom had heard stories about him long before meeting him in person. One coworker laughed after finally shaking Adrian's hand. "I feel like I already know you. Lucas has been telling stories about you for years." Lucas looked slightly embarrassed while Adrian smiled knowingly. "Hopefully only the good ones." The coworker laughed. "Honestly, I have never heard him talk about anyone else with that much admiration." Lucas paused for a moment before realizing something remarkable. Comments like that no longer made him uncomfortable. They no longer made him question himself. Instead, they simply reflected a truth he now accepted with complete peace. Later that evening, Lucas and Adrian stepped outside onto the hotel's quiet terrace overlooking the Denver skyline. Snow-covered mountains stretched across the distant horizon beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. Lucas rested his hands against the balcony railing and smiled thoughtfully. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" Adrian stood beside him. "What?" Lucas looked toward the city lights before answering. "I spent so many years worrying about whether accepting my feelings would change my entire identity." He turned toward Adrian with calm certainty. "Instead, almost nothing changed. I still love baseball. I still complain about traffic. I still drink too much coffee. I still laugh at terrible jokes." Adrian smiled gently. Lucas laughed softly. "The only thing that changed was that I finally stopped pretending the most important person in my life was only important because of friendship." Adrian reached for Lucas's hand as snowflakes drifted gently through the cold night air. Standing together beneath the quiet winter sky, Lucas understood that discovering the truth about his heart had never taken anything away from the person he had always been. It had simply given every ordinary memory, every shared journey, and every future yet to come a deeper meaning. proving that the strongest love sometimes grows so naturally that it feels like home long before anyone finds the courage to call it by its true name. Spring arrived once again, bringing longer days, flowering trees, and the familiar energy that always seemed to fill Chicago after months of gray skies. Lucas often smiled when he realized how little had changed on the outside. He still hurried through morning traffic with a coffee in hand, still spent long afternoons developing marketing campaigns, and still complained every Monday about how quickly weekends disappeared. Adrian still reminded him to bring a jacket whenever the weather forecast changed unexpectedly, still insisted on cooking dinner more often than ordering takeout, and still remembered every birthday, anniversary, and small milestone worth celebrating. The routines were almost identical to the life they had shared before, yet now every ordinary habit carried the quiet comfort of complete honesty. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to clean out the storage room in Lucas's apartment before finally moving the last remaining boxes into the place they now shared together. Dust-covered containers filled with old notebooks, ticket stubs, college textbooks, and forgotten souvenirs slowly emerged from the shelves. Lucas laughed as he opened one cardboard box labeled simply college stuff. Inside were faded photographs from orientation week, handwritten lecture notes, restaurant receipts, and a stack of printed photographs that neither of them had looked at in years. Adrian picked up one picture showing two young college students sitting on a campus lawn eating inexpensive sandwiches while laughing at something outside the frame. "We looked so young," Adrian said with a smile. Lucas leaned closer before laughing softly. "I remember that day. We skipped studying because the weather was too nice." Adrian nodded. "You convinced me that one afternoon away from the library would not ruin our grades." Lucas grinned proudly. "I was right." They continued sorting through old memories until Lucas found a folded piece of notebook paper tucked inside one of the textbooks. Curious, he unfolded it and immediately recognized his own handwriting from nearly 10 years earlier. It was a list titled Things to Do Before 30. The first few goals were predictable: buy a condo, travel to Europe, run a marathon, build a successful career. But farther down the page, another sentence caught his attention: never lose touch with Adrian, no matter where life takes us. Lucas stared at the words in silence before slowly looking toward Adrian. "I completely forgot I wrote this." Adrian smiled gently. "Apparently you knew something important even back then." Lucas laughed quietly, shaking his head with disbelief. "I thought success meant checking off every achievement on this list." He folded the paper carefully before slipping it back into the box. "Now I realize the only goal that truly mattered was the one I almost overlooked." Adrian stepped closer, his expression warm and thoughtful. "Life has a funny way of teaching us what deserves to stay on the list." Later that evening, they walked through their old university campus while visiting friends nearby. Students hurried between buildings carrying backpacks, laughing with classmates, and making plans for the future exactly as Lucas and Adrian once had. Standing beneath the same trees where their friendship first began, Lucas realized that the younger version of himself had been searching for certainty in career plans, future milestones, and carefully organized goals. What he could never have predicted was that the greatest certainty in his life had quietly been walking beside him since the first week of college. As they reached the campus gate, Lucas smiled toward Adrian with peaceful gratitude. "I spent years trying to figure out when everything changed." Adrian looked at him curiously. Lucas gently shook his head. "The truth is, nothing suddenly changed. We simply kept choosing each other through every ordinary season until one day I finally understood that the life I had always been building was never about finding the perfect future. It was about never letting go of the person who had been walking beside me from the very beginning." Several years passed so naturally that neither Lucas nor Adrian could remember the exact moment when their shared routines stopped feeling new and simply became life itself. Seasons continued changing outside their apartment windows. Yet inside their home, the little traditions they had built remained wonderfully familiar. Saturday mornings still began with coffee and pancakes. Sunday evenings still ended with planning the week ahead. And every Friday after work, they still visited the same neighborhood bookstore before walking to their favorite cafe. The owner greeted them by name, and the corner table near the window somehow always seemed to be waiting for them. One warm summer afternoon, they received another wedding invitation, this time from one of the younger co-workers Lucas had mentored for several years. As he opened the envelope, he smiled before reading the handwritten note tucked inside. Please come together. I cannot imagine inviting one of you without the other. Lucas quietly laughed before handing the invitation to Adrian. Apparently people have finally accepted that we are a package deal. Adrian looked at the note and smiled with gentle amusement. I think they accepted that a long time ago. We were simply the last two people to notice. The wedding took place in a botanical garden filled with blooming flowers, shaded walking paths, and strings of lights hanging beneath tall oak trees. During the reception, several guests gathered around Lucas and Adrian after learning they had known each other since college. One young couple admitted they had recently become engaged after years of friendship and nervously asked whether relationships that began that way really lasted. Lucas looked toward Adrian before answering with complete honesty. Friendship never disappeared for us. It simply became the strongest part of everything that came afterward. Adrian nodded in agreement. Love does not always replace friendship. Sometimes it protects it and allows it to grow even deeper. The young couple smiled gratefully before returning to the dance floor. As the evening continued, Lucas stood quietly beneath a canopy of glowing lights while watching newly married guests celebrate with family and friends. He remembered attending another wedding years earlier, standing beside the same person while believing he completely understood his own future. Back then he had thought certainty came from having all the answers. Now he understood that certainty came from trusting the person who always made life feel lighter, calmer, and more meaningful. Adrian walked over carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to Lucas without asking, still remembering exactly what he preferred after all these years. Lucas accepted the glass with a grateful smile. You know, he said softly, I used to think that discovering my feelings would completely change my life. Adrian looked at him with quiet curiosity. Lucas continued while watching the lights sway gently in the evening breeze. Instead, I realized the happiest parts of my life had already been happening for years. The only difference now is that I finally understand why those memories mattered so much. Adrian reached for Lucas's hand with the same quiet confidence that had always defined their relationship. They stood together listening to distant laughter and soft music drifting across the garden. Looking around at friends celebrating new beginnings, Lucas realized his own greatest beginning had never arrived with fireworks or grand declarations. It had started with thousands of ordinary conversations, countless shared choices, and one friendship patient enough to wait until he was ready to understand that the person he trusted most was also the person he wanted beside him for every tomorrow still waiting to come. In that peaceful moment, surrounded by love in all its different forms, Lucas silently thanked every ordinary day that had slowly guided him toward the extraordinary life he and Adrian now shared together. 5 more years passed with the quiet certainty that had always defined Lucas and Adrian's story. Chicago continued changing around them with new cafes, taller buildings, and different neighbors moving into the apartment complex. Yet every meaningful part of their lives remained beautifully familiar. They still walked to the neighborhood coffee shop every Saturday morning. They still argued playfully about baseball statistics that neither of them could ever fully agree on. Adrian still remembered to bring an umbrella whenever the forecast hinted at rain, and Lucas still smiled every time he realized someone knew him well enough to remember the little things before he did. One crisp autumn afternoon, they returned to their old university after receiving an invitation to speak with graduating students about careers, friendship, and building meaningful lives after college. Walking across the same campus where they had first met years earlier, Lucas noticed students rushing between classes exactly as he and Adrian once had. The familiar sidewalks, brick buildings, and quiet lawns carried memories that now felt even more precious because he finally understood what had truly begun there. After the presentation ended, several students stayed behind to ask questions about work, ambition, and balancing personal relationships with professional goals. 1. Young student hesitated before speaking. If you could give one piece of advice to your younger self, what would it be? Lucas looked toward Adrian before smiling thoughtfully. I would tell myself to stop worrying so much about becoming the person I thought I was supposed to be. The room grew quiet as he continued. The people who truly matter will never ask you to become someone else. They will simply help you become more honest about who you already are. Adrian nodded gently before adding, and never underestimate ordinary kindness. Some of the biggest changes in life begin with very small moments that seem unimportant at the time. After leaving the campus, they walked slowly through the nearby park where colorful autumn leaves drifted across the pathways. Lucas laughed quietly as he noticed a young man sitting on a bench, nervously rehearsing something while glancing toward another person waiting near the fountain. Adrian smiled knowingly. Looks like someone is gathering courage. Lucas watched the scene unfold from a respectful distance. A few moments later, the young man walked toward the other person, and both of them smiled with visible relief as their conversation began. Lucas looked back at Adrian. Funny how courage rarely looks dramatic. Adrian nodded. Most of the time, it is simply choosing honesty. That evening, they returned home just before light rain began falling over the city. Lucas stood by the living room window watching droplets race down the glass, while Adrian prepared 2 cups of coffee in the kitchen. The apartment felt peaceful, filled with books collected over the years, framed photographs from road trips, baseball tickets preserved inside small albums, and countless reminders of an ordinary life that had quietly become extraordinary through consistency rather than spectacle. Adrian handed Lucas a warm mug before joining him at the window. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They simply listened to the rain, exactly as they had listened to silence together through every season of their lives. Lucas smiled softly before breaking the quiet. Do you know what I finally understand? Adrian looked at him with the same calm expression Lucas had trusted since college. What? Lucas wrapped both hands around the warm mug and looked toward the rain-covered city beyond the glass. I spent years believing that discovering the truth about my heart would completely rewrite my story. It never did. It simply revealed that the best chapters had already been unfolding beside you all along. Adrian smiled with peaceful certainty, and together they watched another ordinary evening settle gently over Chicago. In that quiet apartment, surrounded by memories built through patience, trust, friendship, and love, Lucas realized that the greatest choice he had ever made was not a single decision on one unforgettable day. It was choosing the same person again and again through thousands of ordinary moments until those simple choices became the most extraordinary life either of them could have imagined.